tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
Speaking of Alberta, let's go to our friend Kris Sims here for a rare Tuesday check-in, given the holiday yesterday. She is the Alberta director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Kris, good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
Likewise. I didn't hear that, so he's skipping the Calgary Stampede. Can you hear me?
That's according to the Western Standard anyway, confirmed by an email from the PMO. So basically they are not interested in, well, he's not interested in being there. And I think Albertans are probably just as pleased because I don't think they were ready to give him the white hat welcome by any stretch. But we've talked a lot, you and I, over the last year about the carbon tax. It's become an incredibly unpopular tax. It's costing Canadians a lot of money, despite the proclamations that it's not. What I find interesting here, and you drew my attention to this, the government has spent $1.7 million promoting the carbon tax around the world. So promoting global carbon taxes. So they don't just want people in Red Deer and Strathroy and Halifax to pay the carbon tax. They want people in Baku and Tallinn and Paris to pay a carbon tax as well. Talk to me about this.
Yeah, so it's one of those things where I had to take a double take at it because I couldn't tell right away if it was 1.7 million or 1.7 billion. And the fact that I didn't blink at the difference speaks volumes because they just as easily could have been a billion. But in this case, it's $1.7 million with an M. And we found this out through Freedom of Information requests with the federal government through our investigative journalist, Ryan Thorpe, there in Ottawa. He and Franco dug this up. And yeah, turns out they've spent around $800,000 in change or so, Andrew, on bureaucrats, keeping seats warm and watering houseplants there in the National Capital Region, trying to promote adopting a carbon tax in other countries. And what I find spectacularly sad about this is that they fail. Like they're really bad at this. So not only are they wasting Canadian taxpayers' money on something silly and frivolous, like trying to convince a foreign country to impose a tax on its people, but they're terrible at it. They haven't succeeded in doing so. Like, I'll just point out the United States of America, it's obviously our closest neighbor, biggest trading partner, huge ally, blah, blah. I just finished driving across 3 states, actually, came home yesterday. And they, number one, depending on how you slice it, it really looks like they reduced their emissions under Trump. And that is largely because they increased their use of natural gas. Reading, they do not have a national carbon tax in the United States of America. And even though their chirpy little sister up here in Canada has been urging them to do so, they still haven't imposed one on their people. So if we can't even convince the United States to have a national carbon tax, why are we wasting money trying to convince countries further afield to do so?
There are 2 things that come to mind on this. Number one is that talk about a race to the bottom is that, we've been saying to the government, even if Canada were to bring its emissions to zero, it wouldn't amount to a hill of beans because emissions are global. So the government says, okay, we'll see you that argument and raise you. Everyone has a carbon tax. There, you can't say we're ignoring the global picture. But the other thing, and this is what I think is so key here, the greatest detriment that one of the greatest detriments a carbon tax poses is that it eliminates any competitive advantage that Canada might have and investing in Canada might have relative to other countries. So if you're to say, oh, why would I invest in Canada, which has a carbon tax, when I can invest and open up my factory in, in Czech Republic, say, because they don't have a carbon tax. The government's trying to make it so that everyone is being punitive, so that everyone is penalizing industry. And as you note, other countries are saying, nope.
Yeah, exactly. Because they know that this is not helping the environment. They know it's not reducing emissions. Because if you start punishing people financially for an essential, okay, heating your home in the winter is essential. Growing and eating food is essential. Shipping your supplies to people who need it and getting to work, those are all essential things. People aren't flying their private jets around the world to, COP conferences for reducing your emissions, right? This is not a have yacht issue. This is a normal working class sort of thing. And yet they're still financially punishing us. And if you take that viewpoint around the world, of course, they have working people and working populations and normal families around the world. And Canada, our little academic class there in Ottawa, trying to say, you know what you guys should do? You should punish people for driving to work and heating their homes. They're rightly telling us to go get lost. The problem here, though, of course, Andrew, is that this is again costing Canadian taxpayers money. $1.7 million, and it's not nothing. It's also growing the size of our bureaucracy. And it's the same sort of thing that the former New York City Mayor Giuliani had when it came to crime. It's the broken windows theory. If you allow for jaywalking and broken windows and graffiti, you're going to have increasing levels of crime. Same sort of thing with dumb things like spending money on promoting a carbon tax internationally. It doesn't work, it wastes money, and it grows government. So again, I'm really glad that the folks there at the CTF in Ottawa's office dug this stuff up, because it points out how absolutely pointless this is. I will point out, I just filled up in Montana on my way back across into Alberta. That's why my voice is so ratched, because I was screaming at a concert for like 3 hours. But I filled up there. It's like 30 cents, around 30 cents cheaper there per liter, same octane for gasoline than it is even here across the border in Alberta. And that's comparing Montana to Alberta. I can't imagine what the difference would be going from a really red state to a really liberal state or province up here in Canada.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. And I go back to the race to the bottom dimension of this here, because we always forget that we don't, but the government does or chooses to ignore that in a globalized economy, you have to be able to sell what you are offering better than other places around the world. Now, obviously, there are shipping costs that have to be factored in there. And maybe Canada can say, okay, we have a bit of a comparative advantage to, say, the US market because of our proximity to it. But the fact that in Canada, it's so expensive to manufacture things, labor is a part of that, yes. The carbon tax adds to it. And we have to stop looking at these things in isolation. The left loves talking about intersectionality. Well, let's talk about intersectionality of taxes and regulations and all of these things here.
I might steal that from you.
It's all yours. It's all yours.
A really good analysis and spot on. And to your point, exactly. So people might remember this big foofara that was happening between the Prime Minister's office, PMO, and Parliamentary Budget Office, PBO. Ottawa loves their acronyms just like the armed forces. So what was happening was the PBO, Parliamentary Budget Officer, had figured out, spoiler alert, that the carbon tax costs people money, even with their precious rebates factored in. Every common sense person already knew this, of course, but they did the math there. And what's really startling is that you take a look exactly to your point, Andrew, the GDP cost, okay? So we're not talking just generally people filling up their minivans or their pickup trucks directly, or even paying, the carbon tax on their heat bill, which is insane. But if you just look at apples to apples, the GDP cost, so the difference between Bill Jones starting a manufacturing plant in Montana with no carbon tax versus starting a manufacturing plant in Alberta with a carbon tax, that difference is costing the Canadian economy billions of dollars per year. And again, that's just the economic cost that the PBO is factoring in there. And that, of course, is why the Prime Minister's office was kicking and screaming for weeks, Andrew, and they didn't want to release this information, but they finally had to cough it up last week, and it's really damaging.
Yeah, and we found that all of the arguments used to justify the carbon tax have not held water. We know it does penalize Canadians. There is and that's even just based on the government's own analysis here. So this idea that, most people are coming out ahead, well, if so, there wouldn't be a point in it.
Yeah, exactly. I always like pointing that out, because you can flip it around and say, oh, well, okay, if it makes everybody rich, heck, make the carbon tax $500 a ton. We'll all be rich, right? That's idiotic thinking. That's childish thinking. I wouldn't want to insult children. That's really silly to think that, because of course, taxes don't make you richer. And number two, exactly to your point, if it's not financially punitive to use a substance, then how do they expect the use of that substance to be reduced? If it's not hurting you in your wallet, so to speak, as they try to say, and deterring you from using it, then what's the point of it, right? This is the whole argument, right, with using paper or plastic bags, right? Or having a deposit on your pop can. If it's a deterrent to throw it in the garbage versus recycling it and getting your money back, that's how their thinking worked. But the problem is that's not how it worked out. In theory, that's what they were trying to do for years. Spoiler alert, people still need to get to work. They still need to eat. They still need to heat their homes. And that is why, even though Canada has a carbon tax, our emissions continue to go up. Even though British Columbia has been the oldest jurisdiction with the carbon tax for the longest time, since 2008, their emissions nonetheless continue to rise steadily. because people use this as essential fuels. And so, yeah, it's not working because it's not reducing emissions. It's not working because now they're trying to spin this and saying, oh, well, it was only ever meant to make you richer anyway, and here's a rebate. If that were true, Andrew, why did the Trudeau government blink when it comes to Atlantic Canada, right? They came out and admitted, yes, this is a financial burden for people to pay a carbon tax on their home heating oil, which is largely used in Atlantic Canada, especially in places like Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island. Why did they then come forward and say, you know what, we're suspending the carbon tax, but just on this fuel and just for the next 3 years? Like, any way you slice it, this is not working out for them.
So explain to me where you think this is headed, because we know that, I mean, correlation is not causation, but we know that Poilievre and Conservatives have been surging in the polls for months now. We know that if you could really attribute one policy to him, even if you're only a casual political observer, it's going to be axe the tax. So the Conservatives have taken up getting rid of the carbon taxes. I'd say at this point anyway, their flagship policy. That might not be the reason they're doing so well in the polls, but it certainly isn't hurting them. And I think that, again, even people that were kind of okay with the carbon tax have realized that in an inflationary economy, it's a luxury item. It's okay, maybe we could afford it in 2015. We can't afford the carbon tax now. But do you think that will remain in place? Do you think that sentiment will remain?
Yeah, I think so. And exactly to your point, because people just can't afford things. So inflation is just astonishing. I haven't checked his math, but I would recommend people go look. I found him on Instagram. There's a gentleman there. Now, again, I have not gone in a deep dive and checked his math, but it looks generally correct. There's a gentleman that has like a Walmart kind of a shopping cart, right? I guess you can do that. I don't actually have the app, but apparently within the app, you can go back through your order history, and he shows it on the screen. And he shows that what he used to spend around I'm guessing around $180 or so back in 2015, he says, he's now spending around $400 or so on pretty much the same items. And so he was trying to point this out. He was just a regular guy trying to point out what inflation is like here in Canada. That was astonishing. And it really shows, like, if anybody who's at the grocery store who keeps an eye on their prices realizes how much things are costing, add to that the price of fuel and the price of housing. It's just astonishing for people. So yeah, to your point, I do think that axing the tax is going to continue to be a main driving force with the popularity of any party who wants to promote it, by the way. And it's really interesting to see Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives make a full 180, thank you very much, after that weird little flirtation they had with their version of a carbon tax. So glad to see them on the right track. I will point out, by the way, I saw that your Audible is now available for the Pierre Poilievre book. So I just ordered it. I just ordered it on my phone, so I'll be listening to it this week. But to your point, I do think this is going to be a major issue, and I think it will continue to be a major issue, even if we have to wait for a year and a half, because I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news. It's just going to get worse because the Trudeau government, they've got a massive deficit. They have no plans to ever balance the budget. They have no concept of money. And so, like, the budget fairy gods are not going to descend upon Canada and just fix things. They have to balance the budget and do smart things, and they're just refusing to do so. So yeah, I do think that's going to be a centerpiece.
Very well said, Kris. Now, you might just be stuck with a view of Kris right now, because my producer, Sean, just told me his power went out. Oh, there we go. I'm back. He switched to a hotspot there. So you might have had to just like pick up the show from there, because we couldn't switch cameras one way or another. Oh, Be Still My Beating Heart. Yes, that is the book that's over my shoulder there. Pierre Poilievre, A Political Life. Now available on Audible, ebooks, Kindle, Indigo, Amazon. It's available anywhere. So, Kris, thank you so much. Hope you enjoy the book.
I will. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.